She thought he destroyed her life with a cruel smile. 3 years later, he was the one on his knees, watching the daughters who carried his eyes. Matthew Harper was the kind of man who carried entire rooms on the weight of his presence. At only 32, he had already built an empire, the kind of empire that crushed rivals without him even lifting a finger. His suits were tailored, his words sharp, his gaze colder than glass in winter. Women adored him, men envied him, and employees feared him. He liked it that way, because fear and admiration were the tools of control. To Matthew, control was everything. Control was the only currency that never lost value. When Rachel told him she was pregnant, it was in his penthouse office overlooking the skyline. She stood trembling, holding on to courage that barely held her upright. For days she had rehearsed her words, imagining a dozen possible reactions: surprise, denial, perhaps even joy. But when her confession left her lips, all she saw was the curve of his mouth twisting upward into a smirk. He leaned back in his leather chair, his hands folded behind his head like a king listening to a court jester. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that once had made her feel safe, now cut into her like blades. "Cry all you want," he said, his tone laced with mockery, as though she had spoken about nothing more significant than a broken shoe. "But don't think for a second this changes anything." His voice echoed across the glass and steel walls, magnifying her shame. It was not just rejection, it was dismissal, like she was a problem to be solved and then forgotten. Rachel felt her throat burn as if she had swallowed fire. This was not the man she thought she loved, not the man she had believed would stand beside her. He had money, power, the world at his fingertips, but not an ounce of warmth for her or for the life growing inside her. She tried to speak, but her voice failed, breaking under the weight of his indifference. Tears blurred her vision, and for a moment the city lights outside looked like they were falling stars. Matthew turned away, already reaching for his phone, already thinking of the next deal, the next conquest. In his mind, her words were an interruption, a distraction from the rhythm of his empire. He thought the problem would vanish as quickly as it appeared. He thought she would vanish. He did not see how his careless smirk would carve a wound so deep that neither time nor success could cover it. Rachel walked out of the office without looking back, her chest hollow and heavy at once. Each step was a declaration, silent but fierce. She would not beg, she would not let her child grow up in the shadow of a man who laughed at love. Outside, the night air cut across her face, cleansing the last of her tears. She placed her hand on her stomach and whispered to the little heart beating inside, promising protection, promising a future. She had no wealth, no empire, no skyscraper built of glass and ambition, but she had something stronger. She had resolve. Inside his office, Matthew Harper sat in silence for a moment after she left. He thought the conversation was over, closed like one of his contracts. But as he stared at the city lights shimmering beneath him, a strange unease crept into his chest. He pushed it aside, refusing to name it. He didn't yet know that this single night would mark the beginning of his undoing. The house that Rachel found for herself and her daughters was far from perfect, but it was hers, and that alone made it a castle. It stood on the edge of a quiet town, a 2-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but beyond its flaws was a terrace that opened to a view of hills rolling like waves toward the horizon. That terrace became her sanctuary, the place where laughter could drown out the silence of her nights and where her daughters' footsteps echoed like music. By the time Sarah and Lily were 3, their presence filled every corner of the house with life. They were identical in so many ways: chestnut hair that caught the sunlight, cheeks that dimpled when they giggled, and those piercing blue eyes that seemed too bright for this world. Yet each girl carried her own soul. Sarah was the daring one, climbing onto the railing of the terrace and reaching her arms toward the sky as if she could touch the clouds. Lily was gentler, often dragging her favorite book outside and demanding that her mother read under the fading glow of evening. Their voices mixed together like a melody, carrying across the neighborhood and seeping into Rachel's heart until she thought she might burst from the simple joy of watching them live. The terrace itself was weathered, the wood cracked in places, but to the girls it was a kingdom. They transformed it into a pirate ship one day, a castle under siege the next, and on rare afternoons, a stage where they danced clumsily to music only they could hear. Rachel would sit with a cup of tea gone cold, her eyes locked on them, and for those moments the weight of the past lifted. She saw not what she had lost but what she had been given. In their laughter she found a reason to endure, and in their arms, when they tumbled against her legs begging for hugs, she found strength she never knew she possessed. Rachel's own reflection, when she caught it in the terrace door's glass, startled her sometimes. The years had carved lines of exhaustion into her face, yet there was also resilience. Her hair, the same warm brown as her daughter's, often slipped loose from its bun, strands brushing her cheeks as she leaned down to kiss scraped knees or tie shoelaces. The brown of her eyes no longer held the same innocence it once had, but there was fire there still. She had promised herself that Matthew Harper's smirk would not define her life. She would raise her girls not in bitterness, but in hope. Yet hope was fragile, and Rachel knew it. There were nights when she tucked the girls into bed and collapsed onto the terrace alone, staring at the hills that stretched endlessly away. In those moments she could almost feel him out there, the ghost of Matthew, haunting her like a shadow cast by the moonlight. She wondered if he thought of her, if he ever regretted. Then she would remind herself that regret would not build a future. It was her hands, blistered and strong, that built the world her daughters knew. On one of those evenings, as the sun slid low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Rachel sat with both girls in her lap. Lily was stroking the worn hem of Rachel's sweater while Sarah pointed excitedly at the shapes the clouds were making. Rachel laughed, a sound she had not expected would ever return to her life, and kissed the tops of their heads. She whispered promises into their hair, promises of safety, of love, of a future where they would never doubt they were wanted. What Rachel did not see was the figure at the edge of the street below. Matthew Harper stood by his sleek black car, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the gravel. He had come without knowing why, driven by an unease he could no longer suppress. He looked up at the terrace and saw the three figures wrapped together in a scene so pure it made his throat tighten. For the first time in years, his eyes watered, though he quickly blinked it away. He told himself he was only curious, only checking. But in truth he felt something break inside him, a crack that no amount of wealth or power could seal. He did not approach, not that night. He stood long enough to memorize the sound of their laughter, long enough to see how his daughters, though he could not yet bring himself to call them his, leaned into the warmth of a mother's embrace. Then he left quietly, swallowed again by the city lights, carrying with him an image he would never be able to forget. Matthew Harper lived in a penthouse that touched the sky, glass walls stretching above the city like a throne room built from steel. From the outside, his life remained untarnished, the empire was still his, deals still bent to his will, and his name still commanded attention in every boardroom he entered. Yet behind the polished surface, silence crept through his nights. He told himself he had chosen this life, that he had sacrificed sentiment for power. But when the noise of the day faded and the city below quieted, he found no rest. His sleep, when it came, was broken and cruel. Night after night he saw the same vision. In the beginning it was only Rachel's face, her brown eyes filled with betrayal and pain as she walked out of his office, her figure dissolving into the blur of city lights. But over time the visions changed. In the darkness of his dreams, two small figures began to appear. At first they were shadows at the edge of his sight, then laughter so faint it sounded like the wind. Slowly the shapes grew clearer until he could no longer deny what he was seeing. Two little girls, hair the same shade as Rachel's, eyes startlingly bright and blue, his own eyes, staring back at him. He would wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, with the sound of children's laughter echoing in his head. He told himself it was only imagination, only guilt twisting his mind. But the more he tried to dismiss it, the stronger it became. Sometimes in the middle of the day, during a meeting with investors, he would catch himself drifting, seeing flashes of blue eyes where there were none, hearing faint echoes of voices that didn't belong in his boardroom. He would clench his jaw, grip the edge of the table, and force himself back into the role of the untouchable CEO. But inside, the cracks were spreading. Matthew had always prided himself on control. Control over numbers, control over markets, control over people. Yet here was something he could not master. His empire felt hollow. He hosted banquets and parties in his penthouse, surrounded by polished strangers, yet every toast, every smile, seemed like glass about to shatter. The more he surrounded himself with excess, the sharper the emptiness cut into him. When he looked into mirrors, he no longer saw power reflected back. He saw loneliness, a man who had traded warmth for wealth and was left with rooms full of silence. Late one night, after a long evening of contracts and empty conversations, he stood at the window with a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. The city stretched before him, endless, glittering, alive. Yet he felt smaller than ever, like a child lost in a maze he himself had built. And then, in the glass of the window, he saw it again, two tiny reflections beside his own, a pair of blue eyes staring into him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with innocence. He dropped the glass, whiskey spreading across the marble floor, the sound of shattering echoing through the apartment. He pressed his palms against the cold glass and whispered into the night air words he would never admit in daylight, "Are you mine?" The question lingered long after the echo died, unanswered and relentless. He could bury himself in work, in deals, in fleeting pleasures, but the visions followed. Each night they returned, sharper, brighter, more insistent. He did not yet know where Rachel lived, did not know the lives she had built without him, but somewhere deep inside he no longer doubted that the faces haunting him were real. Somewhere beyond the city lights were his daughters, flesh of his flesh, growing without him. And though he fought the thought with all the arrogance he had left, a seed of fear began to take root, the fear that when he finally sought them, it might already be too late. Rachel never thought danger would come for her in such a sudden and violent way. Life in the small town had been quiet, modest, and almost invisible, which was exactly how she wanted it. But when you once loved a man like Matthew Harper, invisibility was an illusion. His world was built on power, and in that world enemies came in shadows. She discovered this truth one stormy night when the wind howled across the hills and her daughters were already asleep in their beds. At first, she thought the crackling sound outside was the storm itself, branches breaking against the walls. Then came the acrid smell of smoke, sharp and suffocating, creeping in through the gaps beneath the doors. By the time she opened the front door, flames were licking up the side of the house. Panic surged through her body, but she forced her breath steady for the sake of the girls. She rushed into their room, gathering them both in her arms even as they cried from the sting of smoke. The fire was spreading faster than she could think, swallowing the old wood of the house, filling the hallway with choking heat. Rachel's mind raced. The terrace, if she could reach it, maybe she could get outside through the back. She carried the girls, their small arms clinging tightly to her neck, and pushed through the thickening smoke, coughing and nearly blinded. By the time she reached the terrace doors, the fire roared like a living beast behind her. The terrace railing shook with the weight of heat, and the air was hot enough to blister her skin. She tried to shield Sarah and Lily with her body, whispering to them that it was going to be okay, though she was no longer sure she believed it. Then, above the roar of the flames, another sound cut through, the deep growl of an engine and the sharp slam of a car door. She thought she was hallucinating, but then through the haze and sparks she saw him. Matthew Harper appeared like a ghost dragged from her past, his tailored clothes already marked by smoke and ash. His eyes, once cold and calculating, were wild with urgency. He shouted her name with a desperation she had never heard in his voice before. She froze, torn between fury and disbelief, but his words crashed over her. "Rachel, hold the girls tight. I'm coming for you." He moved without hesitation, pushing through the smoke, ignoring the flames that clawed at him as though nothing mattered except reaching her. In that moment, Rachel saw something in him she had never seen before, not arrogance, not mockery, but fear. Fear that he might lose what he had once so carelessly thrown away. His eyes locked on the children clinging to her, and for the first time she believed he understood who they were. His blue eyes, wide and wet with tears, mirrored the very same eyes staring back at him from the faces of Sarah and Lily. The structure groaned as the fire consumed it. Sparks rained down, and a beam cracked, threatening to fall. Rachel staggered, clutching the girls, but her strength was fading. Matthew reached her just as her knees threatened to give way. He wrapped one arm around Rachel and with the other pulled Sarah and Lily against him, holding them all as though he could shield them with his own body. He shouted over the roar of collapsing wood, promising he would get them out. Somewhere deep inside, Rachel wanted to fight him, to scream that he had no right, but the fire left no room for arguments. The man who had once smirked at her pain was now dragging her through the inferno, covering the girls with his coat, taking the blows of falling debris across his shoulders. They stumbled together through the choking haze until finally the night air burst over them, cool and wet with rain, filling their lungs with salvation. Matthew collapsed to his knees in the grass, holding the girls as they sobbed into his chest, his face streaked with ash and tears alike. Rachel fell beside them, trembling, unable to tell where her fury ended and her gratitude began. She wanted to hate him still, to remember the cruelty of his words, but all she could see was the way he had thrown himself into the fire without hesitation. For the first time since the day she left his office, she did not see a man of steel and money. She saw a father, broken and desperate, willing to burn to keep his daughters breathing. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked clothes, a mixture that clung to Rachel's skin as she sat in the waiting room with her daughters wrapped in blankets beside her. Their faces were blotched from crying, their small bodies trembling not only from the cold but from the memory of flames devouring the world they knew. Nurses moved quietly, whispering instructions, carrying trays of supplies, and checking vitals, but for Rachel the entire building seemed to blur into the background. All she could hear was the shallow rhythm of Sarah's breathing against her chest and the quiet hiccups of Lily as she clung to Rachel's sleeve. She told herself over and over that they were safe now, that the girls were alive and unhurt, but safety felt fragile, like a candle flame in the wind. And then there was the shadow she couldn't shake, the image of Matthew bursting through fire as though it had been nothing. The man she had once feared for his cruelty, the man she had sworn to keep away from her life, had dragged her and the girls out with his own hands. That truth pressed against her ribs, confusing, unbearable, and impossible to ignore. Hours later, when the girls were finally asleep on the hospital bed, curled together like mirror images, Rachel slipped into the hallway to breathe. She leaned against the wall, eyes closed, trying to release the storm inside her chest. That was when she heard footsteps, heavy and uneven. She turned her head and saw him. Matthew looked nothing like the man she had last known. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt scorched and torn, his arms bandaged where skin had blistered. His face, usually so polished, was streaked with bruises and ash that no one had yet cleaned away. He moved as though every breath hurt, but his eyes sought her immediately, desperate, raw, almost pleading. Rachel felt her throat tighten at the sight. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual command. There was no arrogance left, no distance, only something cracked open and trembling. He stood a few feet away, as though afraid to come closer without her permission. "Rachel, I made the worst mistake of my life. I thought money was enough. I thought I could build a world so strong I would never need anyone. But when I saw you in that fire, when I saw our girls, yes, I know they're mine, I realized I've been living in emptiness all these years." Rachel pressed her back harder against the wall, her hands clenched. "Don't," she whispered, but it was not the command she wanted it to be. Her voice wavered, betraying her. She wanted to scream at him, to remind him of the night he smirked at her tears, to force him to feel the years of abandonment. Yet at the same time, the sound of his confession stirred something inside her she had tried to bury. Matthew's steps faltered as though her silence cut deeper than words. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, wincing with pain. He rested his hands on his knees, staring at the floor. "I see them in my dreams every night," he admitted quietly. "I see their eyes, the same as mine. I can't escape it, and I don't want to anymore. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I swear to you, Rachel, I'll never walk away again. If you hate me, fine. But let me be their father. Let me try to be a man who can protect them, not the monster who laughed at you." Rachel's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. For years she had lived fueled by anger and resolve, building a life on her own so her daughters would never feel unwanted. And yet here he was, broken, begging not for her love but for a place in the lives of the girls who carried his blood. She wanted to tell him it was too late, that he had no place here, but the words caught in her throat. Through the glass of the room behind them, she could see Sarah and Lily sleeping, their tiny faces peaceful. They deserved answers, and maybe, she thought bitterly, they deserved their father too. Matthew looked up finally, his eyes shining with tears he no longer tried to hide. "I was blind," he said. "And now I see. Don't shut me out forever, Rachel. Not without giving me the chance to prove I can be different." For a long moment she said nothing, caught between the scars of her past and the fragile possibility of change. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft beeping of distant monitors. Finally she whispered, "It won't be easy. I don't trust you. And I don't know if I ever will again." He nodded, swallowing hard, as though even her cold truth was more than he deserved. "Then I'll earn it. However long it takes." Rachel turned away, wiping her eyes before the tears could fall. She hated that part of her still ached at his words, hated that her heart was not as hardened as she wished. But when she looked back through the window at her daughters, she knew life had already changed. The man she had sworn was gone from their lives forever was here again, and nothing would ever be the same. Rachel carried the weight of sleepless nights as though they had been stitched into her very skin. After the fire, life did not return to the quiet routine she had once built. The hospital became a temporary home, its walls humming with the sounds of machines and hurried footsteps, and in that place of strange security her heart wrestled with a storm she could not contain. Matthew came every day, never asking permission, never demanding forgiveness, only appearing with bandaged arms and tired eyes, sitting in silence or speaking softly to the girls as though the act itself was a fragile gift he could not afford to lose. Sarah and Lily had not known their father before the fire, yet the innocence of children allowed them to accept him with ease. They asked questions that pierced Rachel's defenses, questions that left her staring at them with a helpless ache in her chest. One evening, as twilight filtered in through the blinds and cast the room in shades of gold, Sarah turned her wide blue eyes on her mother and whispered, "Mama, is he our dad?" The simplicity of the question stole the air from Rachel's lungs. She could not answer, not because she did not know, but because the truth carried too much weight. She looked at Matthew then, at the way his expression froze as though he too was holding his breath, waiting for her judgment. Rachel wanted to protect her daughters from the pain she had known, to shield them from the memory of a man who once laughed at her tears. Yet she could not deny the bond already forming. Lily had begun to reach for Matthew's hand without hesitation, and Sarah leaned against his arm when she grew tired, as though their bodies knew what their minds had not been told. Watching them made Rachel's heart ache with both longing and resentment. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had not been there from the beginning, why she had been forced to carry every burden alone, why his pride had been more important than the family he had abandoned. But when she opened her mouth, the words died against the sight of his trembling hands as he read to the girls, his voice cracking not from smoke but from emotion. At night, when the girls were finally asleep, Rachel sat awake in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of their breathing. She thought of the years that had passed, years she had built around defiance, telling herself she did not need him. She had worked, scraped, and bled to give the girls a home, and in that sacrifice she had forged her strength. And yet now he was here, shattered and different, speaking not as a man who held the world in his hands but as one who was terrified of losing it. She hated herself for noticing the change, hated that his eyes, once so cold, now reflected something painfully human. Matthew did not push her. He sat near the girls, read them stories, answered their endless questions, and laughed in ways Rachel had never heard before. He told them about stars and oceans, about cities that shone like jewels at night, and though his voice carried the same authority he had once used to command entire corporations, now it softened with wonder. Rachel stood in the doorway one evening, watching him as Sarah tugged at his sleeve and Lily climbed into his lap, and something inside her cracked. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but a recognition of what her daughters already saw, that this man, however flawed, was theirs. Her anger remained, heavy and sharp, but it no longer lived alone. Beneath it stirred a memory of the love she had once carried for him, a love she had sworn dead. It frightened her to feel its shadow stirring again, to know that part of her longed for the warmth of what could have been. She told herself it was only weakness, that she must stay strong for the girls, that trust was a bridge burned to ash. But late at night, when the hospital halls fell silent, she admitted to herself in whispers she would never say aloud that her heart had not yet decided whether to keep hating or to begin hoping again. Matthew, for his part, seemed to sense her battle. He did not try to win her with grand gestures. He simply stayed, day after day, as if the very act of not leaving was his confession. And Rachel, torn between fury and an aching softness, realized that the hardest fight she faced was not against him, but against her own heart, which refused to let go of the possibility that people could change, even the man who had once broken her completely. Matthew had never known the weight of ordinary life. For years his world had been boardrooms filled with polished tables, flights in private jets where glasses of champagne clinked over contracts, and nights in penthouses that overlooked entire cities. Ordinary life had been something other men lived while he shaped empires. But after the fire, something inside him shifted, and he realized that his power meant nothing in the quiet spaces where his daughters laughed. He made a decision that startled even himself. He stepped away. He sold a portion of his holdings, gave up seats on boards that had once defined his identity, and shocked his colleagues by saying he needed time. The press speculated endlessly, but Matthew did not care. For the first time in his adult life, he was learning to live in a world smaller than skyscrapers but infinitely larger in meaning. His days began not with conference calls but with two little girls tugging at his hands and begging him to braid their hair. He was clumsy at first, his fingers too stiff and impatient, but Sarah giggled every time he fumbled and Lily insisted he try again. Rachel watched in silence from the kitchen doorway, her eyes guarded, yet even she could not hide the faint curve of her lips as Matthew sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by ribbons, surrendering to the challenge of turning chaos into pigtails. When the girls shrieked with laughter at his crooked results, he laughed too, a sound so unpracticed it startled him. There were evenings when he read them stories, his voice stumbling over fairy tale language he had never used in his corporate world. He discovered that Sarah loved adventure tales filled with pirates and storms, while Lily preferred gentle stories of animals finding their way home. Sometimes they curled against his chest as he read, their breathing slowing as sleep claimed them, and in those moments Matthew felt something stir in him that no amount of wealth had ever provided. He realized he would rather hold these children in a modest room than own the tallest tower alone. But it was not easy. The habits of a man who had once commanded armies of assistants and executives did not vanish overnight. There were mornings when he reached instinctively for his phone to check the markets, when impatience rose in him because the girls wanted to stop and pick wildflowers instead of walking straight to their destination. He lost his temper more than once, his voice too sharp, his frustration showing when he failed at the simplest of tasks, tying shoes, cooking breakfast, fixing a broken toy. Each time, Rachel's eyes flashed with warning, and he hated himself for proving her doubts right. Yet each failure drove him harder, not because he wanted to win her approval, but because he could not bear to see disappointment flicker across the faces of Sarah and Lily. Rachel kept her distance, though she could not keep her watchful eyes from him. She studied the way he carried their daughters on his shoulders, the way he sat with them at the table drawing uneven shapes on paper, the way he knelt down when they spoke to him so he could meet their eyes at their level. She noticed how his once impeccable suits were replaced by worn shirts marked with grass stains from afternoons spent chasing the girls in the yard. Slowly, almost against her will, she began to see the difference. This was not the man who had laughed at her pain years ago. This was someone else, someone stripped of arrogance, learning humility one scraped knee and bedtime story at a time. The hardest moments came at night, when Matthew lingered by the terrace where Rachel often sat alone. He never pushed her into conversation, but sometimes he would stand quietly beside her, his hands resting on the railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the hills swallowed the fading light. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. It carried questions Rachel was not ready to answer and apologies Matthew could never fully speak. Yet in that silence there was also the faintest possibility of something new, something fragile, built not on power but on the lessons of pain. Matthew knew he could not erase the past, but he also knew that every day he remained, every moment he tried, he was writing something different for the future. He was no longer the man who smirked behind glass walls. He was a father, imperfect but present, a man learning that true strength was not measured in wealth but in the laughter of two little girls who now ran into his arms as though they had never doubted he would be there. The terrace had always been a place of memory for Rachel, a place where the laughter of her daughters had first helped her believe she could survive without the man who had broken her. Now, years later, it became something entirely different. The house they lived in was no longer scarred by fire or neglect but rebuilt with care, painted in colors chosen by Sarah and Lily themselves. Flower boxes lined the edges of the terrace, spilling over with blooms that the girls watered each morning, and in the evenings the family gathered there, the setting sun painting the hills with gold. Rachel stood at the railing one late summer evening, her hair loosened by the breeze, watching as her daughters chased each other in circles across the wooden boards, their laughter brighter than any memory of pain. She found herself laughing too, not the brittle laugh of survival but one that came from a heart that was finally beginning to heal. Matthew was there as well, not distant, not haunted, but present in a way that had once seemed impossible. He had changed in ways Rachel could not have imagined when she had walked out of his office years ago. His empire was smaller now, but the man himself was larger, his presence grounded not in power but in humility. He still bore scars from the fire, faint marks along his arms and shoulders, reminders of the night he had chosen to step into the flames for them. Yet those scars no longer looked like weakness. They were proof of what he had become, a man who had been forced to burn away his arrogance to find something worth keeping. The girls adored him with the wholeheartedness only children could give. Sarah loved to climb onto his back, insisting he gallop across the yard like a horse, while Lily preferred curling up against him during quiet evenings when he read aloud. They spoke to him without hesitation now, calling him Dad in voices so natural that Rachel sometimes had to remind herself of the years when that word had been forbidden even in her thoughts. Watching them, she felt both pride and grief, pride that they had embraced love so easily, grief for the time lost that could never be reclaimed. Yet as she stood there on the terrace, listening to their laughter mix with the rustling of leaves, she realized the present was enough. Matthew walked toward her slowly, his expression calm yet tinged with something deeper. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him but not so close that she felt trapped. His eyes, still the same piercing blue that had once cut her down, now looked at her with a vulnerability she never thought possible. He took a long breath as though steadying himself, then sank to one knee before her. The sight stole the air from Rachel's lungs. "I don't expect you to forget," he said, his voice quiet but steady, carrying none of the arrogance it once had. "I don't expect you to erase the pain I caused. But I ask you to let me spend the rest of my life making it right. Not with money, not with promises, but with actions, with days and years where I stand beside you and our girls. I love you, Rachel, and I will keep loving you whether you can forgive me fully or not. But if you can, if there is even a piece of you that still believes in us, then let me prove it." Rachel felt the tears rise before she could stop them. She had sworn once that no words from him would ever move her again, yet here she was, trembling not from anger but from the force of the emotions she had buried for so long. She looked down at him, this man who had once been untouchable, who now knelt with open hands and no defenses, and she saw not the CEO who had mocked her years ago but the father who carried their daughters on his shoulders, the man who had walked through fire and rebuilt himself brick by brick. She thought of the nights she had spent alone, the promises she had whispered to her children that they would never feel abandoned, and she realized that somehow, against all odds, he was keeping that promise with her. The girls, sensing the moment without understanding its depth, ran to them, throwing their arms around Matthew and Rachel together. Sarah laughed as she pulled on Rachel's hand, while Lily pressed her cheek against Matthew's shoulder. Rachel met Matthew's eyes over their daughters' heads, and for the first time she allowed herself to speak the words she had kept hidden. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking but true. The terrace seemed to hold its breath as the four of them stood there, wrapped in the glow of evening. The darkness of the past no longer owned them. The smirk that had once defined their story was gone, replaced by tears, by laughter, by the fragile but unshakable strength of a family finally whole. In that moment, Rachel understood that life had not given her the fairy tale she once imagined, it had given her something better. It had given her love that had been tested in fire and still endured, love that carried scars but also the unshakable promise of a future together.